Hi there. If the following free content proves to be useful to you, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and checking out the pinned comment down below for more options to support my efforts. Thank you for watching, and please enjoy the video. But yeah, so to kick off with solid architecture, so solid brah. So solid lesson number 1. And the first lesson is going to be on the single responsibility principle. So just really quickly before I proceed, what are SOLID principles? So it has to do with a bunch of really awesome programmers and software architects kind of coming together, and some people are quite famous. Unfortunately, I forget the name of the individual who actually created the SOLID acronym, but if you've heard of the name Robert C. Martin, he talks about SOLID principles all the time. And they're basically ways in which you can build object-oriented programs in a way that sort of, without getting really deep into it, the way you build these things, if you do it intelligently, can help you solve problems down the road, and it can actually eliminate problems that you would have to otherwise deal with if you just built like crappy God activity spaghetti code applications, which are impossible to maintain. So the first principle we'll be talking about, and I hear the garbage truck outside, so I'm just going to close the window. That garbage truck. And so the first one is going to be the single responsibility principle, and I've just got a quick little bunch of notes here to go over. So what is the single responsibility principle? So to kind of give my own rehash, I would encourage you to look up other definitions, but here's kind of my vague definition for it. So and let me just make sure that yeah, okay. So basically what it is this is my definition. Each module or class should generally be responsible for doing one thing. So there's more technical definitions. So your first question, if you're a beginner, might be, well, what the hell is a module? What's a class? My suggestion is, so for module, I want you to kind of think of maybe like a whole package or a whole layer of an application. So for example, let's say I'm building like a fairly classic three-tier software architecture where you've got like the presentation layer, maybe the business logic, and then like the data logic, or whatever words you want to use. So in that case, you've got like the user interface as a single responsibility, and then you've got like maybe the application's logic, and then like the data logic, and those are module level single responsibilities. However, we can get more specific. So we can have specific classes or specific files, and what we'll find is those should generally only do one thing. So that's probably kind of vague to beginners. So what I wanted to do is kind of bring this into an analogy which I like to use. So for the first example, let me just catch up on my notes here. So for the first example, I wanted to talk about so I want you to kind of imagine we are building architects. We're designing a house or something like that, or an apartment. It doesn't really matter too much. Now, how can we kind of think of something that's analogous to software architecture but is a lot easier to think about? Well, let's say we're designing a house and you want to build a module called a kitchen. And this kitchen, its responsibility is managing food. So that's the first thing. So we've got this sort of module kitchen. Let's kind of pretend it's part of our app if you want to. And then within that kitchen, you're going to have classes, or you're going to have appliances, which have more specific functions. So for example, we've got maybe a fridge or a class, and its job, store food at a desired cold temperature. Or we've got a class oven. Its job is heat food up to the desired at the desired temperature. So the point I'm trying to get at here is I don't want you to go too crazy with the single responsibility thing. Like, they can be the responsibilities themselves can be quite broad. Like, for example, if I was building a view, like a fragment or something, I wouldn't necessarily say one fragment to set the text of one text view, but I would say the responsibility is like UI stuff. So that's the main thing. So why is that kind of important? What does that actually do? Well, there's a couple things, but one of the most important things that the single responsibility principle provides you with is it does a whole bunch of things. It makes things easier to test. It allows you to draw like logical conclusions about where different pieces of your implementation, and I'll explain what that is in a bit, should go in terms of which class. It allows you to sort of think, okay, does this make sense to put this implementation or this responsibility here in this class? Should I pull it out into a different class? Should it be in a different layer? So what do I mean by implementation? I mean the code, the actual code necessary to fulfill the responsibility. So for example, for the user interface, the implementation in the user interface would be like, find view by ID, setting IDs, and then view.setText. So that's implementation stuff. So why was I kind of saying that we can draw logical conclusions? Well, to go back to our sort of kitchen analogy, I have to ask you, let's say you're designing a house. Does it make sense, if you're designing a kitchen, to put a toilet 2 feet above your stove or your oven? Does that make sense? Would it make sense to put a bedroom in their class? Like, would you just stuff this one friggin' room full of everything and then leave the rest of your architecture just ambiguous and barren? No, it doesn't. In the context of building architecture, for the most part, it makes sense for a kitchen to have a sink, an oven, blah, blah, blah. It makes sense for a bedroom to have a bed, maybe chairs, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point being, that's where the conclusions can come from. If you give a module or a class a single responsibility, then whatever you put in there either pretty much belongs or it doesn't. So that's kind of the important thing. So the last thing that I'll say, let's see what my next thing is here. So the last example I'll talk about, and then we'll get into viewer questions, has to do with how we can apply the single responsibility less analogously, just more directly in the context of like a model view presenter software architecture. I realize some of this might be slightly off screen, so I'll try or my face might be blocking some of it. Let's try and fix that. So for the second example, if you're not familiar with model view presenter, just in a nutshell, it's too difficult to summarize in like a minute, but the model kind of represents and provides access to structured data. The view interacts with the user by drawing the user interface and listening for UI events, although it should basically just forward those events to the presenter. It shouldn't really deal with them. And the presenter is responsible for kind of communicating and coordinating with other layers. So as you can see, each of these layers or modules or whatever friggin' word you want to call it, they have kind of a broad responsibility. And what that can do is, just in the context of like object-oriented programming, we can, and if we combine the single responsibility principle and we follow it well, and we structure our application with an architecture, and we use objects or even just like events or things like that to represent our data, then we get this really neat scenario where, let's say, for example, where is my phone? What our applications start to look like is if I just pull up a random application here. So let's do pause trainer. So for example, when I I'll press the plus button, and that's going to trigger a UI event in the view. The view is going to forward that. Its responsibility is just to forward the event, so it's going to forward that to the presenter. The presenter is going to decide what to do with it, and it's going to say, okay, the user wants to build or add a new alarm. Hey model, add a new alarm. The model's going to do its thing, and then and then it's going to either respond to the presenter, it's going to call back or whatever. It's going to call back, and then it's going to either say fail or success or whatever, and then that result the presenter is going to get, and it's going to pass it into the view. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is, like, basically if you give things good responsibilities and you follow good object-oriented principles and you have a proper software architecture, the flow of your application becomes super testable because you've separated everything out into like module, so you can run tests. So let's say I'm testing the middle part of my architecture. I can fake this part, fake that part if I need to. I can just test this part in isolation. So, and there is a text. So that's basically it for single responsibility principle, and hopefully I'm kind of giving you some insight into how you can start thinking about software architecture. Also, for the beginners out there, if there's anything I mentioned in here that doesn't really make a lot of sense, please ask me to clarify it. I'd be happy to talk about it because this stuff is super important.